Hey everyone, time for another edition of the Pick Six. I'm your host, Mike Wobschall, inside the TCO Performance Center in Eagan with your questions. They're right here. Let's answer them. Question number one comes from David in Byron. With our salary cap situation, do you see any way the Vikings could re-sign Anthony Barr or perhaps put the franchise tag on him and trade him in order to get another decent draft pick? Well, David, I think the best case scenario is we find a way to re-sign Anthony Barr. He's a good player and he makes our defense even better. The Vikings have been creative in the past, finding space to lock up players like Eric Kendricks and Xavier Rhodes and Linval Joseph. It'd be great if they can do that with Anthony Barr. If they can't, and Barr leaves via free agency, the Vikings would get a compensatory pick in the 2020 draft. Question number two comes from Terry in Bloomington. How many draft picks from the past 5 years are still with the team? And does it seem that Rick Spielman has struggled or thrived at drafting players who remain with the team? Well, in the last 5 years, the Vikings have 23 players on the roster right now who were drafted in that span. So I'd say Rick Spielman and his staff excel in this part of the roster building process. Now, getting first and second rounders right, like Barr and Waynes and Mike Hughes and Eric Kendricks and Dalvin Cook and Brian O'Neill, that's one thing. But where you can really make hay is when you get it right in the middle rounds and the late rounds with Danielle Hunter and Pat Elflein in the third round, or Stephon Diggs in the fifth round. How about Jaron Kearse and Stephen Weatherly in the seventh round? And then to take it a step further, when you get it right with undrafted players, that's where you can really help your team. Adam Thielen, Anthony Harris, CJ Ham, Marcus Sherrills, Holton Hill, all guys that Rick Spielman and his staff found in undrafted free agency. Lots of ways to build your roster, and you got to use all of them to be efficient. The next question comes from Avery in Mankato, Minnesota. What are the most important aspects of the combine in today's NFL? Has it shifted because of the changes to the game, with the offense becoming more prevalent? I don't think so, Avery. I think the two most important parts of the combine, and we're going to be there next week in Indianapolis, are the medical part of the combine and the opportunity to meet with these players. Those two aspects of the combine are invaluable for teams as they continue with the evaluation prospect of the incoming set of players. Remember, we're going to have coverage of this year's combine wall to wall from beginning to end right here on Vikings.com next week, so stay tuned for that. The next one comes from Gary. When we watch offensive linemen at the combine, what drills give the best indication that these guys can play at the next level? Well, Gary, I'd have to imagine some of the footwork drills and maybe the bench press, which shows some of their functional strength, are important drills for coaches and scouts to watch. But at the end of the day, it's the tape. Go back and watch these guys play the game of football on tape in college. That will give you the best indication. Jason in New York is up next. What position do you think is the hardest for teams to evaluate in the draft? I think quarterback is super important. That means there's an added level of difficulty to it, so that's a tough one. Also, offensive linemen are tough to evaluate. In the college game, it's so spread out and pass happy. In the NFL, it's more balanced and not as spread out, so that can add a challenge when it comes to evaluating linemen. At the end of the day, the most important part of the process is to understand what you want to do schematically and what traits the players have, and you want to find the best matches. Our final question comes from Dan in Sioux Falls. I've seen you promote Jim Marshall and Steve Hutchinson for Hall of Fame consideration, and it got me thinking about other underrated Vikings in history. Who are a few others who deserve more pub? I got three for you that were really fun to watch, really productive, and deserve more attention than they get. We'll start with Henry Thomas. He had almost 100 sacks as a nose tackle for the Vikings, a really good player in the 80s and 90s. How about Robert Smith? When he retired, he was the Vikings' all-time leading rusher. Adrian Peterson came along and surpassed most of those records, but Robert Smith, when he was done playing, was the best running back in Vikings history when it comes to the numbers. And lastly, Steve Jordan, perhaps the best tight end in Vikings history, although Kyle Rudolph is giving Mr. Jordan a run for his money. But when Steve Jordan retired, he held all the tight end records for the Vikings, so I think he's a guy who deserves more publicity than he gets. That's it for this week's edition of the Pick Six. We'll be back next week from the Combine, so make sure you continue to submit your questions to the email address at the bottom of the screen, and we'll see you next week.